The first thing everyone noticed was how quiet the funeral was, and not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel like a mistake. No one cried out loud. No one dared. The wind moved through the cemetery like a warning, tugging at black coats and whispering secrets the dead had taken with them. She stood at the edge of the grave, her fingers trembling as they rested on her swollen belly, feeling her child move as if sensing that something enormous had just ended. Or perhaps begun. To the world, her father had been an ordinary man. A private businessman, reserved, forgettable, but the men standing around the grave were anything but ordinary. Their suits were tailored too perfectly, their posture too disciplined, their eyes far too alert for grieving friends. They didn't look at the coffin. They watched the horizon, the trees, each other. As if danger itself might dare to show its face today. Her father's final words echoed in her mind louder than the priest's prayers. He had spoken them from a hospital bed, his voice weak but his gaze sharper than she had ever seen it. He had taken her hand and told her the truth at last, that he was not a small man, not a harmless one, but the unseen ruler of an empire built in shadows. A boss who never showed his face. A name spoken only in whispers. And then, as if confessing a simple sin, he had said, "Everything I built now exists to protect you." She had wanted to scream at him. To demand why he had waited so long. Why he had let her marry a man who knew nothing of the storm behind her name. But before she could speak, the machines had gone silent, and the truth had been buried inside her like a second, heavier heart. Now that heart beat painfully as the coffin was lowered into the ground. Her husband stood beside her, but he felt farther away than any stranger. His hand never reached for hers. His eyes flicked repeatedly to his phone, the glow of the screen reflected in his pupils. He looked bored, irritated, as if this funeral were an inconvenience delaying something better. She noticed how his jaw tightened, how his foot tapped impatiently against the wet earth, and a cold realization settled over her. He wasn't mourning her father. He was waiting for freedom. When the final prayer ended, people began to leave in silence. No condolences, no embraces, just brief nods from men who looked at her with something between reverence and loyalty. One of them, an older man with silver hair and a scar along his cheek, paused before her. He lowered his head slightly, not in grief, but in respect. Her husband didn't notice. He was already walking toward the car. As the cemetery emptied, rain began to fall harder, soaking her coat, blurring the world into shades of gray. She stayed where she was, staring at the mound of fresh earth, her breathing slow and controlled. Inside her, her child kicked again, stronger this time. She pressed her palm there, and for the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel weak. She felt watched, protected, and somewhere, far beyond the grave, something old and powerful was shifting, awakening to the fact that its king was gone, and his daughter had been left alone in a world that had no idea who she truly was. The conversation ended before she realized it had truly begun. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he simply stood in the center of the living room, hands in his pockets, eyes oddly calm, as if he were discussing the weather instead of dismantling her life. The words fell from his mouth in a neat, practiced order. He was unhappy, he had thought about this for a long time, he deserved a fresh start. Each sentence landed with surgical precision, cutting away whatever hope she still clung to. She sat on the edge of the sofa, one hand braced against her lower back, the other protectively circling her belly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cologne, his cologne, and the normalcy of it all made the moment feel unreal. Outside, the city moved on, traffic humming, people laughing somewhere below their window. No one knew that a family was ending behind these walls. He mentioned the baby once, only once. His voice softened briefly, just enough to sound reasonable. He said the child deserved parents who loved each other, not a home built on obligation. He didn't say he doubted the baby was his, but the implication hovered in the air like poison. She felt its sting anyway. The cruelty wasn't in what he said, but in how easily he said it, as if her pregnancy were a minor detail instead of the center of her world. When she asked if there was someone else, he hesitated for less than a second. That was answer enough. He admitted it then, lifting his chin slightly, as though honesty itself were a kind of bravery. He said her name carefully, almost tenderly, describing her as understanding, uncomplicated, real. Unlike this marriage, unlike the secrets that had begun to surface around her family after her father's death. He didn't say the word mafioso, but she saw the fear behind his eyes. He was running, and he was using love as an excuse. The divorce papers appeared 2 days later. He slid them across the table without meeting her gaze, his phone lighting up with messages he didn't bother to hide. A woman's name, a heart emoji. Her fingers trembled as she signed, not because she doubted her choice, but because something inside her was finally hardening. Grief had hollowed her out. Betrayal was filling the space with something colder, sharper. A week after that, the photos surfaced online. He stood beside his mistress, no, his wife now, smiling under white lights, a champagne glass raised in celebration. She wore a sleek dress and victory in her eyes, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The caption spoke of new beginnings, of fearless love. Friends commented with congratulations. No one mentioned the pregnant woman he had left behind. She saw the images late at night, alone in the apartment that no longer felt like home. The pain came in waves, but beneath it, there was clarity. He had chosen what he believed was safety, simplicity, a future untouched by shadows. What he couldn't see was that those shadows were already moving, quietly closing ranks around her. The first visitor arrived the next morning. Then another. Men who spoke softly, respectfully, calling her by her last name with a weight it had never carried before. They asked about her health, about the baby, about what she needed. No explanations, no threats, only loyalty offered without conditions. As the door closed behind the last of them, she rested both hands on her belly and exhaled slowly. She was alone in marriage, abandoned in love, but she was no longer unprotected. And somewhere, far away, the man who had walked out on her believed his new life had begun, unaware that the consequences of his choice were already unfolding, step by quiet step. By the time her child was born, the city had begun to change in ways most people couldn't explain. Deals collapsed without warning. Influential men canceled meetings, fled the country, or suddenly retired from public life. It wasn't chaos, it was order, precise and deliberate, moving like a shadow that knew exactly where to fall. She watched it all from a distance, never giving a command, never raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her father had built a system that recognized blood, and now it recognized her. The labor was long, exhausting, and silent except for her breathing and the steady instructions of the doctors. When the baby finally cried, sharp and alive, something inside her broke open, not with pain, but with resolve. She held her child against her chest, tears sliding into the soft blanket, and understood that everything from this moment forward would be about protection. Not revenge, not pride, survival, legacy. News reached her in fragments. Her ex-husband's business partner had vanished during a routine flight. His main investor had pulled out overnight. Bank accounts froze due to irregularities. None of it was loud enough to make headlines, but it was loud enough to ruin a man who had built his life on borrowed confidence. He started calling her then. First cautiously, then desperately. She never answered. Meanwhile, her world grew quieter, safer. The apartment was replaced by a guarded estate on the edge of the city, surrounded by trees and silence. Nurses came and went. Security shifted in careful patterns. The men who once stood silently at her father's funeral now stood watch over her and her child, treating both with the same unwavering respect. They didn't call her boss. They didn't need to. Their loyalty was inherited. One evening, as the city lights flickered beyond tall windows, she finally allowed herself to look at the past without pain. The marriage had been real once, she knew that now. But it had never been strong enough to survive truth. Her ex-husband had loved the version of her that was harmless, the one without gravity. When faced with depth, with danger, with power he couldn't control, he had run. He understood too late what he had lost. By the time he realized that her father's death hadn't dismantled an empire but transferred it, his world was already shrinking. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends stopped answering. His new wife grew distant, resentment replacing triumph as fear crept into her eyes. The man who had once walked away so confidently now moved through life looking over his shoulder. She never confronted him. She didn't need closure. Closure was a luxury for people without responsibilities. She had a child to raise, a legacy to shield, and a future that demanded strength over sentiment. Standing by the window, Holding her sleeping baby, she felt no hatred, only certainty. Her father was gone, but his final promise had been kept. The world that had seemed so dangerous now bent quietly around her, reshaping itself to ensure one thing above all else, that she and her child would never be abandoned again.